Greetings everyone. Welcome to our first demonstration video. In this video we'll work through an example of how to do a problem tree. Now in the tutorial presentation for this module you learn that a problem tree, or that the problem tree, is a technique that we can use to map out the complexity of a problem that we're trying to solve. So this includes the direct and indirect drivers of the problem, but it also includes the problem's direct and indirect effects. So the problem tree is the first step in making your theory of change, and we'll talk more about the theory of change in Module 4. So let's go ahead and get started here. For our problem tree, we're going to use a made-up, make-believe example from a fictional country. But it's based on a composite of real-world examples, and so you'll probably understand the story and some of the characteristics. Now, the made-up country is called Keithtopia, and yes, I did, I did name the country after myself. But Keithtopia is a small island developing state, and it experiences many of the issues common to other small island developing states. So here you can see some of the details. So what we've done in Keithtopia is our project development team, we've conducted an evidence-based analysis already, like in Module 1. And we've done a review of policy documents of the Keithtopia National Adaptation Plan, the NAP, and the National Adaptation Program of Action, and other climate change documents and policies and strategies and so forth. And from this work, we understand that because of increasing global temperatures, because of global warming, well, sea level is rising along the shores of Keithtopia. And we know this again from our literature review. And we also know that it's an adaptation priority for Keithtopia, for the government and people of Keithtopia. So these changes in environmental conditions are causing problems for many of the coastal communities in the country, as you might imagine. Some of the problems that we're starting to see is decreased agricultural productivity, and this comes because of salinization of the soil. So the salt water from the sea gets into the soil, and it makes it much harder for the people of Keithtopia to grow things. There's crop damage and more crop failure, and the fruits and vegetables that they grow, they don't yield very well. So children are starting to miss school because of health issues associated with they're not getting enough to eat, and also there's salt water that's getting into the water. People in Keithtopia use groundwater for their drinking water, and because of rising sea level, we're starting to see more and more saltwater intrusion, and so that's an issue because it has downstream health impacts. So children are missing school. There's also loss of jobs. Because people are losing their farmland, and some other reasons as well. Whenever there's a king tide, it causes damage. These are high tides that are higher than normal high tides. There's high costs for repairs by the government, especially for roads that run through the coastal area, the coastal zone of Keithtopia. Repairs for schools that may be damaged by rising sea levels and so forth. And we're also starting to see more and more forced migration. So people are being pushed away from these areas that are continuously flooded by sea level rise. So it's a big issue for climate change, and the government has decided to take action. It's already been an issue now, and it's projected to get worse in the future. So we've got projections that show that the rate of sea level rise in Keithtopia will increase in the future. So that's some of the background of the problem that we're facing, of the situation that we're facing, and we want to develop a climate change adaptation project that is consistent with this evidence base that we've developed, but we also want it to be consistent with the strategies and policies, the climate change approach for Keithtopia. So the way that we're going to do this after our evidence base is we're going to use a problem tree analysis. And we've already gone over this in the self-guided tutorial and also the introductory video for this module. But let's look again at problem tree analysis. Again, here you can see a beautiful tree, and I think it's a deciduous tree. That may be a breadfruit tree. So let's look at the various elements of the problem tree analysis. First we've got our core problem. And the core problem is like the trunk of the tree. It's like the thick part of the tree. The core problem is a basic problem that your project is going to address. And then we've also got our direct causes. So the direct causes are the big roots of the tree. Right? These are the things that are directly contributing to the core problem. So if we think about the core problem and what we ask, remember in the self-guided tutorial and also in our introductory video, we talked about asking why. So we ask why the core problem exists and the direct reasons why the core problem exists. These are the direct causes. Now we also have indirect causes. These are second order causes of the core problem. They don't directly cause the core problem, but they're down the road factors that contribute to the core problem. The indirect causes lead to the direct causes, and then the direct causes cause the core problem. So we've got a chain of causality that we're talking about here. So the indirect causes correspond to the roots as well, but the lower level roots. So we've got a hierarchy here. Now the next part of the problem tree analysis is the direct effects. The direct effects are the things that are directly caused by the core problem. So for example, if we've got sea level rise, and that's not our core problem, but let's say that we've got sea level rise and direct effect of sea level rise is increased coastal erosion. That would definitely be a direct effect. But then we've got our indirect effects, and these things are caused down the road by the core problem. Right? These are second order effects. So sea level rise, a direct effect of that would be coastal erosion. And then maybe an indirect effect would be loss of agricultural productivity. So the sea level rise doesn't cause the loss of agricultural productivity directly. It causes the loss of agricultural productivity because it is damaging a useful resource, which is the land. It's causing coastal erosion. So the reason I say that is because when we deal with our problem tree, it's very important that we have good causal relationships and that we don't leave things out. So let's look at the first step here. The first step is to define the core problem, as you can see on your screen. The core problem is that's the main issue that your project is eventually going to address. That's the core problem. Now, determining the core problem is sometimes more difficult than it looks at first glance. So sometimes you have to put some work in to really determine what the appropriate core problem is. In many cases, people make mistakes early on in deciding to address the wrong problem. They try to solve the wrong problem. So we'll give you an example. As you can see here, now we have identified our core problem as sea level rise. And in the earlier slides, I talked a lot about sea level rise. It sounds like in Keitopia that sea level rise is a very big problem. Yeah, it's a very big problem, and that may be the core problem. However, this is not a good selection for a core problem because it's not a problem that we can solve. So regardless of how much money you have or how good engineering skills you have, no matter how good your capacity is and how many resources you have available to you, you are not going to be able to solve the problem of sea level rise. Sea level rise is inevitable, and it will continue into the future. I think the estimates, even if we were to completely shut down all greenhouse gas emissions today, sea level rise would continue for at least 500 years into the future. And so you're not going to be able to solve sea level rise. Rather, what you address is the consequences, the impacts of sea level rise. So in determining what our problem is, our core problem is, the first thing that we want to do is identify a core problem that can be solved. They can be solved through a project. There's no project that you're going to do that's going to be able to solve sea level rise. Now, there are some exceptions, obviously, for small island developing states, or very small islands or isolated infrastructure like airports or things like that. You may be able to build a seawall around these assets, but in most cases, that's very, very expensive. And you're definitely not going to be able to do that with this SAP project because it's not a Category C project. So what's the core problem that needs to be solved? The forced migration, is it the lack of a seawall? Is it damage to coastal communities due to sea level rise? Now let's take a look at this one. This has potential to be a good core problem because we can address this. We can reduce damage to coastal communities due to sea level rise. So when I'm doing my problem tree, I'm thinking ahead to what the ideal state is, what the desired condition, what the improved future is that I want to bring about with my project. And so the core problem has to be something that's feasible, that I can solve. So we'll talk about the ideal future and the desired state in module 4. When we talk about the objective tree, which is another tool, it's a complementary tool to the problem tree. But if we look at damage to coastal communities due to sea level rise, now this is potentially something that we can address. And there are a number of ways to do it. So let's decide on this to be our core problem for Keithtopia. This is a good core problem. Now, what's next? This demonstrates, it demonstrates that it's a climate change problem because sea level rise in most instances is a climate change issue because it's resulting from global warming, and our evidence base tells us that. So this is one good element or a good aspect of a good core problem. It's also a problem that we can address with a SAP project, with a Simplified Approval Process project. We don't need to build a seawall. We don't need to do a lot of engineering, but we can probably find some entry points for a project such that we can reduce damage, reduce loss, reduce the impact on livelihoods and lives because of sea level rise. So now that we've got our core problem figured out, the next thing we want to do is determine the non-climate factors that are causing damage to coastal communities. We've already linked this to climate change through our evidence base in Module 1. We know that damage to coastal communities due to sea level rise is coming from climate change. But remember, it's not feasible for us to solve the sea level rise issue. So instead, we need to tackle the things that make people, places, and things vulnerable to the impacts of coastal communities. Right? We need to tackle the non-climate factors that are leading to damage to coastal communities. So now, before we go any further, I want to make sure that we understand that doing the problem tree should be a participatory process. It should involve a variety of stakeholders because different stakeholders have different perspectives on the problem, and those perspectives are valuable. And they also have different information that they're going to bring to the table. So we want to make this process as participatory as possible to keep us from having tunnel vision, because we go into problem identification exercises with a lot of preconceived notions. We may think that we already know what the direct causes and the indirect causes of the problem are. We may think that we already understand the structure of the problem. But the reality of it is that, well, we have set ways of understanding things, and sometimes we need to challenge our preconceived notions of what the structure of the problem is. But another very important aspect of this is that if the project design process is not participatory, if certain stakeholder groups feel like they have not been involved in the process, well, then they won't have ownership over the project. And what that means is they may not want to participate in the project or support the project. And in the very worst cases, they may actively try to undermine the project because they don't see it as acting in their best interests. So remember that stakeholder engagement is something that we do continuously throughout the design process and throughout the implementation process. It's very important to have stakeholders engaged in the problem tree process. Another important aspect of doing your problem tree that we recommend, it's much more practical. Make sure that you do this. We're doing this on a computer and demonstrating it with PowerPoint. However, if you're really doing a problem tree exercise, in most cases, if it's participatory, you'd like to do it in a wide open space where people have space to move around and engage with one another. But you should also use post-it notes or sticky notes because they're easy to move around. So the problem tree is something where you want to revise it over and over and over again. And you should choose a technique and tools that make it easy to revise the problem tree that you're putting together, because you'll make mistakes and you'll rethink the relationships between the different pieces of the problem tree. But anyway, let's move on to our direct causes, right? So this is a first step, or the second step after defining the core problem. Now, the direct causes of those, like we said, they're non-climate factors that contribute to the vulnerability of people, places, and things. And these are most likely the parts of the problem that you're going to address with your project. So here, remember that our core problem is damage to coastal communities due to sea level rise. And so with our core problem, the first thing that we want to do is identify the things that directly contribute to damage to coastal communities. And we put up 3 examples here, and these are not good examples. These are bad examples of direct causes, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But we have lack of housing, we've got lack of tools, and we have not enough fish. So these are all bad examples of direct causes because they don't directly or logically connect to the damage to coastal communities due to sea level rise. So for example, look at lack of housing. Let's test the logic here. If we have a lack of housing, will that lead to damage to coastal communities due to sea level rise? Well, maybe and maybe not, but there's not a direct connection between lack of housing and the damage to coastal communities. Same thing with lack of tools. A lack of tools does not directly cause damage to coastal communities. It could be that we're talking about planning tools and things like that, but the lack of planning tools by itself does not directly lead to the damage from sea level rise. And the same thing about not enough fish. Not enough fish. If we have not enough fish, will that cause damage to coastal communities? Well, no, that's not a direct connection. So instead, right, we've come up with some better direct causes here. So always remember this when you're working on your problem tree, is that you want things that make sense. So for example, instead of, before we had lack of housing, but that doesn't directly damage coastal communities. But rather, let's describe it in a different way. We've got lots of people that are building in vulnerable zones. Lots of people that are building in zones that are vulnerable to sea level rise. Now, if people build in vulnerable zones or in zones that are vulnerable to sea level rise, would that lead to damage to coastal communities because of sea level rise? And I think that we can all agree that the answer there is clearly yes. So this is a good example of a direct cause of damage to coastal communities. Then we've got structures are poorly built, right? In many places, that especially in low-lying areas or in dangerous areas, people build things. They build their houses out of using substandard construction techniques. So if structures are poorly built, would that lead to damage to coastal communities from sea level rise? And again, I think that we can agree that the answer to this is yes. And then we've got damage to mangroves and coral. And in this area, we've got damage to mangroves and coral coming. We'll talk about why that's happening in a few minutes. But if we have damaged mangroves and coral, would that lead to increased damage to coastal communities due to sea level rise? And the answer to that is yes, too, because mangroves and coral, as you know, are buffers to coastal erosion and storm surges and king tides. So that's our good direct causes. Now, why are all of these direct causes occurring? That's the next step. We want to look at the indirect causes. Right? Once we have the direct causes, we'll look at the indirect causes, because people build in vulnerable zones. Structures are poorly built, damage to mangroves and coral. Eventually, we want to turn these conditions around. So we don't want people to build in vulnerable zones. We want structures to be built using more resilient techniques, and we want to lessen or reduce the damage to mangroves and coral. But at this point, we don't know exactly how to do that. We don't know what our leverage points are our control knobs. And so we need to keep probing. We need to keep identifying aspects of this problem tree until we can identify things that we can change. Leverage points or control knobs. Entry points for where a project might be active. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to continue asking why. Now, if you recall from remember from the introductory video, I told you about my 5-year-old daughter and her asking why when she noticed a problem of homelessness on the beach in Hawaii. We just continue to ask why questions until we have a very good understanding of what the core problem is. So why are all of these direct causes occurring? Why? Why are people building in vulnerable zones? Why are structures poorly built? Well, some answers that we come up with here. And remember, this is evidence-based. So this is research that we're doing here, right? We don't just make these things up. We have to have data and evidence to support all of the things that we put in the problem tree. But we come to find out, after doing, a literature review and field studies and focus group discussions and things like this, well, structures are poorly built because there's a lack of skills to build better structures. People don't have the skills to build more resilient houses. But they also don't know about sea level rise, right? They don't know about, because sea level rise is slow. It happens over the course of very gradually and slowly over the course of a lifetime. And it's not something that you notice on a day-to-day basis. So people may not know about the rate of sea level rise and what will happen in the future. And then structures are poorly built. Why? Well, because we have a lack of materials. And so people are forced to build their homes and other structures out of anything that they can find. It could be cardboard, it could be plywood, it could be discarded metal, things like that. So this is why structures are poorly built. Now, let's continue to ask why. Why is there a lack of skills to build better structures? And what we find out, again, we're doing focus groups or we're doing surveys with people that live in the community. We're doing key informative interviews with government officials. We may be talking to people in NGOs. We're looking at vulnerability assessments. We're looking at whatever kinds of data and information that we can find. And the answer that we come up with, lack of skills to build better structures. Why? Well, because there's a lack of training. Now, if you're paying attention, you may be thinking, oh, a lack of training. Aha. That is a potential entry point for my project. That's something I can maybe do something about, a lack of training. I may be able to influence that situation. I may be able to change that. And how would you change that? Well, you'd simply provide training, right? But first, let's test the logic here. If we have a lack of training, would that lead to a lack of skills to build better structures? And I think the answer is yes. And if we have a lack of skills to build better structures, will the structures be poorly built? And again, the answer to that is yes. So remember that we're looking for direct causal relationships. And we want them to be, they're direct relationships. We don't want to miss anything, because if we miss steps along the way, that means that we may be missing leverage points or control knobs, entry points, things that we could potentially change. Okay, so let's do the same thing. Let's look at damage to mangroves and coral. And we want to ask why. Why is there damage to mangroves and coral? And to answer this question again, we'll look at the evidence. We want everything that we put here in the problem tree to be evidence-based. So why do we have damage to mangroves and coral? Well, we find out that we have unsustainable mangrove harvests for fuel and building materials. In Keytopia, people particularly like to use mangrove wood for cooking fuel because they think that it makes food taste better. But they also use the mangroves for building materials. And so people are harvesting the mangroves. At the same time, we have unsustainable fishing practices, maybe bomb fishing, dynamite fishing, things like that, that are causing damage to the coral reef. We also may have mining for aggregate. People take the reef to use as a building material or to build roads and things like that. That's not on our problem tree, but that's potentially another indirect driving cause. But as you can imagine, there are many things that can lead to damage to mangroves and coral. So let's test the logic. If we have unsustainable mangrove harvests for fuel and building materials, will we have damage to mangroves and coral? And the answer to that is yes. And if we have damage to mangroves and corals, will we have damage to coastal communities due to sea level rise? Again, the answer there is yes as well. But on this node, or on this leg of the problem tree, this set of roots, we still don't have a leverage point. We still don't have something that we can change or influence. There's nothing there that tells us, well, what do we need to do to address the unsustainable fishing practices? Or what do we need to do to improve mangrove harvests, right? Or to address the unsustainable mangrove harvests? We need to go a little bit further. We need to dive deeper. And so we'll ask why. Why is there unsustainable mangrove harvests, and why are there unsustainable fishing practices? And so that gets us to, for the fishing practices, lack of awareness and lack of incentives. So for example, people may not be aware of the damage to the reefs. They may not be aware of better fishing practices, sustainable fishing practices. They may not be aware of the long-term impacts of poor fishing practices. But they also may not be incentivized to manage their fisheries and their coral reefs in a wise manner. There could be incentives that are encouraging people to take as many fish off the reef in as short a period of time as possible. So what does this mean? What can we do here? Well, there are potential entry points here. Lack of awareness, well, maybe we can introduce some activities that will raise awareness. Lack of incentives, maybe we can create some incentives for more sustainable fishing practices. Then when we get to unsustainable mangrove harvest, again, the lack of awareness and lack of incentives for better resource management, those may contribute also to unsustainable mangrove harvests. But also we may have no alternative materials. Maybe the people don't have a choice. They don't have any alternative for cooking fuel or for building materials. And so again, you should be thinking at this point, that's a potential entry point. We give them alternative materials for cooking, and there are lots and lots of ways to do that. But what this allows us to do is to come up with an evidence-based approach to addressing the core problem. So we're not pulling the interventions, the activities out of thin air for our project. We have a good rigorous process for identifying what the project ought to do. Now let's look over here at people build in vulnerable zones. Well, why do they build in vulnerable zones? Well, there's no hazard maps, and also there's poor enforcement. No hazard maps. There's no maps of sea level rise or vulnerable zones, so people don't know what areas are vulnerable. And there's poor enforcement of codes. So maybe there are codes or zoning regulations in place, but they're not being enforced. So let's look at both of these and figure out why. Why are there no hazard maps? Well, because it turns out the area has not been surveyed. And there's a lack of map making skills. So in both of these cases, there's potential entry points for project activities. We can survey the area, right? We can do that with our project, but we can also do technical skills development or capacity development for a lack of map making skills. Why has the area not been surveyed? Well, there's no survey skills, or maybe there's no mandate to conduct a survey. So again, these are things that we could address with our project. And let's look at poor enforcement. Maybe in the enforcement agency there's a lack of staff, there's a lack of training, there's budget constraints. So perhaps we can train the staff, right? That's something that we can do. But perhaps we can somehow come up with a mechanism whereby the agency is better funded. And that may be through issuing permits for using resources or things like that. There are lots of different ways to do that. Yeah. Okay, so now we've got the roots laid out for our problem tree. We've got our direct causes and we've got our indirect causes down here, and we've tested our logic. We know that lack of training, for example, if we have a lack of training, we're going to have a lack of skills to build better structures. And if we have a lack of skills to build better structures, then structures are going to be poorly built. That makes sense. And if structures are poorly built, well, when there's sea level rise, we'll probably have damage to coastal communities. So that's our roots of our problem tree, as you can see from the cartoon over here. Now what we want to do is move up into our branches, and this is where the effects are. And we'll start off with our direct effects. And so if we have damage to coastal communities due to sea level rise, what are going to be the direct consequences of this? Well, I think first we start off with loss of jobs. If we have damage to coastal communities, well, lots of people in coastal communities are employed in fishing, and so there may be damage to piers and other facilities that fisher folks need to make their living. It could be damage to other things, stores and shops and food processing and other things due to sea level rise. Or farmers may lose their livelihood, as we said, because of the farmland is less productive near the coast. Another direct effect could potentially be less food production. Yeah, if there's less fish being produced because of sea level rise, or if agricultural productivity goes down because salt water is getting into the soil and reducing the productivity of the land, well, then that's going to lead to less food production. So that makes sense. What else will damage to coastal communities do? Well, maybe forced migration. So as the village, as a community becomes less livable, as it's harder to live there, well, that may drive people to move away from that community, and they may migrate to the capital of Keytopia. And we see that happening in many small island developing states where people are moving from coastal settlements or from outlying islands that are having problems with sea level rise and coastal inundation. Well, they're starting to move into the larger cities. So we may see forced migration. And then what? Children cannot attend school because of damage to coastal communities. It could be that maybe the schools are damaged from sea level rise, or maybe it's difficult for the children to access the schools. What else? Higher repair costs by government. This is definitely something that would be a direct effect of damage to coastal communities, especially if infrastructure is damaged repeatedly. Roads and water and sanitation and hygiene infrastructure, like we said earlier, schools. As these things are damaged more and more frequently, well, that increases the repair costs to the government, and that takes money away for the government to spend on other development priorities. So this is an important aspect of climate change to highlight in your concept note, is that climate change really costs a lot of money. Yeah, and the more that you can quantify that, the better off you're going to be. But you can make the argument, you can demonstrate this with as much evidence as possible that, well, climate change is causing the impacts of climate change are causing the government to divert money away from other important priorities. This is a good way to justify your funding request to the GCF, and we will talk about that in Module 6 and Module 7. So that's our direct effects. These are the low branches, right? And we can test our logic here like we've done before. If we have damage to coastal communities due to sea level rise, would that potentially lead to forced migration? Directly lead to forced migration? And I think the answer to that question is yes. So then we move on into our indirect effects. And we see we have negative impacts on health and malnutrition. Those are clearly follow-on effects from less food production. You have more malnutrition in extreme cases, and stunting and undernutrition. Then we've got some less money for other government services, like we mentioned a minute ago. Future loss of income. If children can't go to school, that's a really important thing because it diminishes their future earning capacity. So it really hurts the human resource development for the whole community and for the whole country. And that's not just a short-term thing. That's a long-term. It's a long-term thing. And what else? And overall, we have a decreased quality of life. So now let's take a look at a couple of these things. Future loss of income and no money to buy food. Now I think you can imagine that maybe if you have no money to buy food, or if there's less food production, can you imagine that those things may actually feed into unsustainable mangrove harvest for fuel and building materials? Or less food production may cause people to embrace more unsustainable fishing practices and so forth. So we actually have some feedback loops. The more this happens, then the more that unsustainable fishing practice happens. And that creates a cycle that gets worse and worse and worse. So that's a very important thing for climate change adaptation and for GCF projects. As I've mentioned before, and I will mention this again, is that the GCF really likes us to be attentive to vicious cycles. A vicious cycle is a process that creates vulnerability. Right? The more vulnerable you are, the more vulnerable you become. It's a downward cycle. It's a trajectory. It's a process. And what they'd like us to do is to identify these vicious cycles that create vulnerability to climate change and somehow figure out how to turn those into virtuous cycles or good cycles. And these good cycles would be cycles that processes or trajectories that actually contribute to resilience and adaptive capacity. So that's really what we're looking for. We've got an example here of a vicious cycle, and if we can turn this around into a virtuous cycle, that's a really good thing to do. All right, so then we've got our indirect effects. We've got our direct effects, and it looks like our problem tree is about finished. So you've got your indirect effects, direct effects, core problem, direct cause, and indirect cause. They're all color-coded here, so it's easy to see. So then we want to validate this, right? We want to make sure, we want to do some quality control on our problem tree before we move on. So we've got 4 questions here, and actually, before we get into these 4 questions, I want to make sure that we understand that this needs to be validated by stakeholders, not just validated by me, not just validated by the Climate Change Adaptation Committee, but we need to have good validation of this from a wide range of stakeholders. But also that we'll ask 4 questions about this. Is this a climate change problem? Now, you remember in Module 1 we talked about this. GCF will provide money to address climate change problems. So if we take climate change out of the picture, do we still have a big problem? And I'm going to say, because this is a made-up example, I'll say no. Right? So if we did not have sea level rise, then all of these issues would not, all of these bad effects up here would not be so bad. It's actually climate change that is really causing this problem to be unmanageable. It's causing it to spiral out of control. Does my logic make sense? Test the logic, right? So we've done that several times already. We also want to make sure that we have an evidence base, right? How did I get this information? So for every node here, for every block, lack of awareness about sea level rise, for example, I need some evidence to back that up. How do I know this? Well, maybe I did a survey of people in the community and government officials. Lack of building materials, again, maybe I have some research that indicates that there are no alternative building materials. So everything here needs to have evidence base. And then lastly, this is an extremely important question. So what are my control knobs or leverage points? That's a term that I like to use. And I'm going to throw up a definition here for you for control knobs. These are the things that you'll design your project around. These are things that you may be able to control or influence somehow, right? So these are the things that you may be able to change. So let's go back. You can't necessarily change everything in your routes here. Some of these may be outside of your control. So what we want to do is identify the ones that we can control, right? And this is what I'm going to design my project around. So here's an example of some control points or control knobs or leverage points for this particular problem tree. And let's look at them here. Let's line them up, all up here. And we've got budget constraints here. This is just money, right? So we're going to provide money with a project. So let's get that one out of the way. But look at these other ones here. Lack of survey skills. So programming activities, this really comes later on in the process in Module 7. The exact things that we're going to do, the exact steps that we're going to take. But we want to identify at this point the things that we can change. We don't necessarily have to describe how we're going to change them, but we want to describe the things that we're going to change. So knowing where you're headed, right? This gives you some direction so you don't get lost along the way. So let's look at some examples from lack of survey skills, right? What could we do? We could potentially organize and conduct staff trainings on land survey techniques and best practices, if that's appropriate for this particular situation. That's one way to develop survey skills. Now again, we'll talk about this in Module 7, because there's lots of ways to do survey skills. Yeah, there's many ways that you could do that, many different approaches. You have to choose the approach that is right for your context. So maybe this organize and conduct staff trainings is appropriate for your context, but maybe it isn't. No mandate. So we could draft guidelines for improving building codes and things like that. That could give us a mandate. Lack of staff. We could hire and train staff responsible for enforcing building codes. That's something that we can do. Of course, in a project, we probably won't do that because you don't hire government officials with projects. But this is one thing that we can do. Lack of training. Well, we want to provide training for climate resilient construction techniques. And again, there are a lot of ways to do that, right? But as you see here, this is why these things are control knobs. Yeah, why we call them leverage points. We can change them. No alternative materials. Well, provide sustainable materials for construction. And the procedure to do that is what may be tricky, but we can figure it out in Module 7. Lack of awareness. Well, what do? You build awareness, right? Conduct community workshops to raise awareness on sustainable land management or something like that. Yeah, there's lots of ways to raise awareness. You may do public service announcements, radio programs, you may have demonstration projects, you may use school curriculum, you may work through churches or mosques or faith-based organizations. There's lots and lots of ways to do this. Lack of incentives. Well, maybe we can develop an incentives program to promote sustainable fishing techniques. So again, these are our control knobs, or these are our leverage points. And when you're doing your problem tree, one of the most important points is to pick out, isolate these things, and understand what you may be able to influence and what you may not, what you probably will not be able to influence. And don't bother trying to change the things that you cannot influence with your project. So now I'd like to have a look at a real-world example, and this is a problem tree, a completed problem tree that comes from a workshop, a project preparation workshop that we conducted a few years ago. And so I'm going to, you'll see my arrow, my mouse moving around a little bit on the screen, And that's so that I can point out aspects of this problem tree to you. And I can also zoom in. And so what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in a little bit, and then we're going to move around. So the core problem is reduced agricultural production or productivity. And first of all, you can see that that our problem tree here, the team that did this problem tree, did it on butcher paper and put it up on a board so that lots of people can see the problem tree, and lots of people can reflect on it and talk about it. And they use these slips of paper, not sticky notes, but slips of paper that can be replaced and moved around. And eventually they decided that their core problem was going to be reduced agricultural production. And we can presume that that is from climate change, the physical process of climate change, either shocks or stressors. And they didn't put that on this sheet because to save space. But let's just look at a couple of the driving causes here. And we see decreased yields. We're going to say decreased agricultural yields leads to reduced agricultural production. And that makes sense. But we also have decreased human capital. And that would mean people doing the farming, and that would lead to reduced agricultural production. That makes sense too. Reduced agricultural area. So that refers to farmland. If you have less farmland, then it makes sense that you're going to have reduced agricultural production. Over here we have decreased purchasing capability of the agri sector. So that seems to refer to demand for agricultural products. And if you have reduced demand, then you probably do have reduced agricultural production. And then we also have destruction of post-harvest facilities. So this would be things like storage and processing facilities. And so the problem is that these are being destroyed, or they're in disrepair, or they're deteriorating for some reason. And that's leading to reduced agricultural production. And that makes sense because you would probably have more spoilage and so forth. Post-harvest losses. So in fact here, this is a good linkage, but we might put something in between here in the middle. This is destruction of post-harvest facilities leads to increased post-harvest losses, which leads to reduced agricultural production. So overall this is good. There's just one very simple change I would make. So let's continue to look at the indirect causes. So these orange ones are the direct drivers of the core problem. With decreased yield, we get to failed crops and soil quality, decreased soil quality. Why do we have failed crops? Well, because of shift in crop cycles. Why do we have a shift in crop cycles? Because of waterlogging and erosion. Why do we have waterlogging and erosion? Because of extreme weather events. So that you can see that this problem tree traces all the way back to climate change, physical processes. So that's good. We've got an impact chain that's been integrated into the problem tree here. Why is soil quality going down? Well, more agricultural inputs are needed to increase yields. And this is kind of a cycle here. I think we can see that they're pointing to a cycle. So there's a vicious cycle here. If soil quality goes down, you need more agricultural inputs to increase yields. That makes sense. And then if you put more agricultural inputs into increased yields, maybe that will decrease the soil quality even further. And I think that is consistent with what happens in some places. What else do we have? We've got increased runoff. Why? Because of decreased H2O availability. We've got extreme weather events, heavy rains. That goes directly to increased runoff. Increased runoff leads to decreased soil quality, leads to decreased yields. So all of these things here, this is our impact chain analysis, and all of that makes sense. Now let's look over here at decreased human capital. Why? Because there are fewer farmers. Well, that makes perfect sense. If you have fewer farmers, you're going to have decreased human capital. If you have decreased human capital, you're likely to have reduced agricultural production. And why do we have fewer farmers? Well, because of a shift in vocation. People are choosing different jobs. There's a shift to non-agricultural economic activities. And why? Because of urbanization. So these are clearly non-climate drivers that are leading to a reduction in agricultural productivity. Let's look at reduced agricultural area. Why? Well, conversion to commercial residential areas, destruction of irrigation facilities, mismatched land use planning, population growth, lack of legislative support, and so forth. So you can see that this is a very comprehensive problem tree. And some of these things clearly in the roots, the direct drivers and then the indirect drivers, some of these things we may be able to address, and some of these things we may not be able to address. So, for example, drought. We're not likely to do anything about drought, but decreased H2O availability, we might be able to improve storage of water. Yeah. What else? Fewer farmers, shift in vocations. These are things we may not be able to address with a project, but perhaps we could create some sort of incentive for people to get into farming and to keep them into farming. Mismatched land use planning. So we could improve land use planning processes to be more considerate of agricultural land, or to take into consideration the impacts of climate change on agricultural land, and work that into land use planning to somehow compensate for climate change impacts on land use. So there are a lot of things that we could do here. Now let's go up to the effects. Reduced agricultural production leads to economic losses, leads to change in farming practices, leads to higher prices of agricultural products. That makes sense. That's just simple supply and demand. Higher prices of agricultural products leads to food insecurity, especially for the most vulnerable, for the poorest of the poor, and so forth. So here we have a pretty good example of a problem tree that was worked out. Remember, this was worked out in a workshop, and so we're doing this in probably an afternoon. And when you do your problem tree, it will probably take you longer. It will be a participatory process. You'll want to revisit it over time. So that's the example. On the next slide, we'll go back to the presentation, and we'll wrap this up. All right, so that about does it for problem tree analysis. I think you probably have the idea of how to do a problem tree. We've also included a guidance sheet in the module so that you can do your own problem tree. Remember that problem trees, you'll get better at it the more that you do it. But let me leave before we close out this video. I'd like to leave you with some final thoughts, some final best practices on the problem tree. The first is that when you're doing your problem tree, make sure that your problem tree process it's participatory. And we talked about that earlier in this video, but make sure that you're not excluding people, because people have different perceptions, and they have different information and different takes on the structure of a problem. And they may not agree. Everybody may not agree when developing the problem tree, but eventually all stakeholders will reach a common understanding, and that's extremely important to have a broad-based understanding and agreement about the structure of the problem, so that you can have a project that is representative of all the stakeholders and has broad stakeholder buy-in. That's a good element for a successful project. Next, test your logic. Now, you've heard me say this several times in the course of this video, but every step of the way, ask yourself, does this make sense? And talk through the connections that you're making in your problem tree. And I would say do that for every tool that you use in developing a concept node or a project. Always test your logic. Does it make sense? Talk through the causal pathways. Next, make sure that you have an evidence base for each piece of the problem tree. So for all of the causes and all of the direct causes and the indirect causes, make sure that you have some evidence to back those up. In many cases, we're tempted to write down explanations for problems that we feel like everybody takes for granted, that everybody knows. But in some cases, we find that common knowledge, or the things that everybody thinks are correct, or not necessarily correct. And so it's good to have an evidence base, because there are a lot of misconceptions about what causes problems out there. So we want to have an evidence-based approach. Think about the problem tree as a living document, and so you can revise it. It should take time to do a problem tree. For me, when I'm doing a problem tree, it sometimes takes weeks, not straight, but off and on. I work on a problem tree for weeks, and I have to revise it as new information becomes available, or as I find out new things about the problem. So this is good if you have to do this, right? But don't be afraid to revise. And similarly, lastly, our last point is don't be afraid to tear down the whole problem tree and start over. Sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes new information becomes available. Sometimes the way that you have formulated the problem just doesn't work. It just doesn't make sense. And in these cases, you just have to start over again. But don't be afraid to do that. Yeah, don't be afraid of that. It's an important part of the process. And it happens to the best of us. So that's it for Problem Tree. Good luck in developing your own problem tree. And I'll see you in the next module.